When Aunt Rose hissed, "Who invited her?" the air around the dinner table froze. My stepfather's eyes narrowed, and before I could answer, his hand found the back of my neck again. But that night, the backyard lights flickered. Not from the storm, but from the motion sensor I'd installed. Because this time, I had witnesses. This time, I wasn't the one being cornered. My name is Clara Doyle, and I am 32 years old. For the last 2 of those years, I had been a ghost to my own family, a name mentioned in passing, if at all. Returning was like driving toward a shoreline you knew was ravaged by a hurricane you'd barely survived. The air itself felt different, heavy with unshed rain and unspoken history. As I turned onto the familiar tree-lined street, the houses were the same, neat suburban boxes with manicured lawns and cheerful flower beds that belied the quiet desperation within. My mother's house, now Franklin's house, was at the end of the cul-de-sac, a 2-story colonial with pristine white siding and black shutters, looking like a postcard from a life I never had. The early summer evening was thick and humid, the kind that clings to your skin. The scent of cut grass and blooming hydrangeas mingled with the more immediate, pungent smell of charcoal and grilled meat. From the street, I could hear the party before I saw it, the murmur of familiar voices, punctuated by a sharp laugh, Uncle Jeff, probably, and the clink of glasses. It was the sound of a family performing normalcy, a well-rehearsed play I had once been a part of. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, the leather cool against my clammy palms. I had spent 2 years building a wall around that part of my life, brick by painful brick. Coming back felt like taking a sledgehammer to my own foundation. I parked a block away, under the shade of an old oak tree, and took a moment. The plan, my plan, was a cold, hard thing in my chest. It was precise, calculated, and left no room for the flood of messy emotions that threatened to surface now. The quaver in my stomach, the phantom ache in my shoulder, the suffocating memory of a hand over my mouth. I pushed it all down. I was not the 17-year-old girl who had fled this house in the middle of the night with a duffel bag and $27. I was a woman who had come back for a reckoning. Walking up the driveway, my heels sinking slightly into the sun-softened asphalt, felt surreal. Every detail was achingly familiar, yet alien. The slight crack in the third concrete paver on the walkway, the way the front door was slightly off-center, the rose bushes my mother babied, their petals a riot of pink and red. I didn't go to the front door. Family gatherings were always in the backyard, a sprawling green space enclosed by a tall wooden fence, a fence I now knew intimately. As I rounded the side of the house, the scene opened up before me. String lights were draped between the posts of the back deck, casting a warm, golden glow on the 20 or so people scattered across the lawn. My cousin's kids were chasing fireflies near the property line, their high-pitched shrieks briefly cutting through the adult chatter. Uncle Jeff was indeed manning the grill, a stained apron over his polo shirt, flipping burgers with theatrical flair. My mother was flitting between groups, a plate of appetizers in her hand. Her smile stretched just a little too tight, a familiar tell I could spot from 100 yards away. And there, holding court by the drink cooler, was Franklin. He hadn't changed. Same thick neck, same barrel chest straining the fabric of his expensive shirt, same easy, confident posture of a man who owned everything he surveyed, including the people. The laughter and conversation, a warm and flowing river of sound, hit a dam the moment I stepped from the shadows of the house onto the grass. It didn't stop all at once. It was more like a slow, creeping freeze. One cousin saw me. His eyes widened, and he fell silent. Then his wife turned, her smile faltering. The silence spread like a contagion, a ripple effect of discomfort and shock moving through the crowd until the only sounds left were the sizzling of the grill and the distant whine of cicadas. Every eye turned to me. I felt like an actor who had walked onto the wrong stage, into the wrong play. My mother froze mid-step, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, a flicker of hope, and a deep, gut-wrenching fear. Her gaze darted immediately to her husband. But it was my Aunt Rose who spoke, her voice a sharp, venomous hiss that cut through the thick air. She was sitting at the main patio table, a half-empty glass of Chardonnay in her hand, her face pinched with disapproval. She set her glass down with a deliberate click. Who invited her? The question hung in the air. An indictment. It wasn't just a question. It was a judgment. It said, "You are not welcome here. You are the disruption. You are the problem." My mother's smile was a desperate, crumbling thing. "Rose, please," she whispered. But the words were lost, swallowed by the suffocating tension. She took a half-step towards me, then stopped, trapped by the invisible leash Franklin held. He hadn't moved, but his presence dominated the entire yard. He slowly turned his head, his eyes, small and dark, fixing on me. He took a long, slow sip of his beer, then lowered the bottle, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this, the power he had to command a room with a single glance, to turn a family celebration into a public trial. "Good to see you survived, kid," he said, his voice a low rumble laced with undisguised mockery. The word survived was a deliberate choice, a sharp, poisoned dart aimed right at the heart of the past. He was reminding me, and everyone else, that he was the victor, that he was the one who remained, while I was the one who had been cast out. No one else spoke. My uncles and cousins shuffled their feet, suddenly finding the grass at their shoes fascinating. Their silence was its own form of violence, a complicity I had known my entire life. They were bystanders then, and they were bystanders now. I met Franklin's gaze, holding it steady. The scared teenager inside me wanted to shrink, to apologize, to run, but I wasn't her anymore. I was here for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with forgiveness or reconciliation. My eyes drifted from his face, past the silent, staring family members, to the far western corner of the yard, to the tall privacy fence that separated our property from the woods beyond. And there, nestled discreetly near the top of a fence post, almost invisible in the deepening twilight, was a small, dark lens. Just below it, a tiny red light blinked once, a steady, rhythmic pulse, the motion sensor. My motion sensor. It was working. It was watching. No one else knew it was there. They didn't know I had spent 3 weekends pretending to volunteer for a community safety initiative, offering free security assessments to the whole neighborhood. They didn't know I had used that excuse to map out every blind spot, every angle. They didn't know that my return wasn't a surrender. It was an ambush. Franklin thought he was the predator, that this was his territory. He had no idea the hunter had just walked into the trap. I took a slow, deep breath, the air thick with the smell of barbecue and betrayal. The warm glow of the party lights felt cold on my skin. The moment was coming. The script had been written 15 years ago, in bruises and fear. Tonight, I was just here to film the final scene. The years of silence had a sound of their own. It was the low hum of a refrigerator in a one-room apartment, the hiss of late-night traffic on a wet street, the sharp clatter of plates in a restaurant kitchen where I worked 60 hours a week. It was the sound of a life being lived in the margins, deliberately and defiantly separate from the world I had escaped, standing there in the golden glow of the party lights, with Franklin's taunt hanging in the air. Those silent years roared back to life in my memory, as precise and ordered as exhibits in a courtroom. I left home 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. It wasn't a dramatic, tear-filled departure. It was a quiet extraction in the dead of night. He had cornered me in the hallway that evening, his breath sour with whiskey, his bulk blocking out the light from the living room. It was over something trivial. I'd left a glass on the coffee table. His rage, however, was never proportional. His hand, thick and calloused from his construction work, closed around my throat. It wasn't the first time, but something in his eyes that night was different, colder. He'd leaned in close, his voice a gravelly whisper against my ear. "One of these days, you'll push me too far, and I'll bury you under the new deck out back. No one will even think to look there." He smiled then, a tight, thin-lipped expression of absolute power. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I had learned that stillness was the only defense, a lesson taught in bruises and choked-back sobs. I simply waited for him to release me, and when he did, I walked to my room, locked the door, and began to pack. Before I left, I tried to tell my mother. I found her in the kitchen, washing dishes, her back to me. I stood in the doorway, my voice barely a whisper, and laid out the facts, the grabbing, the threats, the way he looked at me. I told her about the hallway, about the deck. I expected shock, anger, protection. What I received was a silence that was somehow more violent than his rage. She kept washing the same plate, scrubbing it over and over. Finally, she turned off the water, dried her hands meticulously on a dish towel, and faced me. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine. They were fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "He's just strict. Clara," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He had a hard life. You provoke him. You always know which buttons to push." That was it. The moment the world fractured, it wasn't just a denial. It was a verdict. I was the guilty one, the instigator. My pain was my own fault. I looked at the woman who had raised me, who had once read me bedtime stories and kissed my scraped knees, and I saw a stranger, a hostage who had come to love her captor. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded, turned, and walked out of the kitchen, and a few hours later, out of that house forever. The first few years were a blur of exhaustion. I abandoned my plans for college, taking a waitressing job at an all-night diner. I learned to live on caffeine and cheap tips, to sleep on a lumpy mattress that smelled of dust and other people's lives. I built a fortress of solitude around myself. No close friends, no serious relationships. Intimacy felt like a liability, a weakness that could be exploited. I was surviving, but not living. Meanwhile, news of my old life would trickle in through reluctant cousins or old high school acquaintances. Franklin's construction company, a small, two-man operation when he first married my mother, was growing. He was landing bigger contracts, his face occasionally appearing in the local paper, shaking hands with the mayor, sponsoring a little league team. He was building a reputation as a pillar of the community, a self-made man. And then came the final, brutal stroke of his victory a year after I left. He bought the house my mother had lived in her whole life, the house my father had left her. He put it in his name. He owned my childhood home. He owned my mother. He had erased every last trace of my father and of me. I tried to forget. I moved to a different city, got a better job managing a bar, even started taking a few online classes. I told myself that the past was a closed file, locked away in a cabinet in my mind. But some evidence you can't file away. There was a scar, a pale, jagged crescent on my left shoulder blade, a permanent souvenir from my 17th birthday when he'd thrown me against a doorframe. Most days, I didn't think about it, but sometimes, catching a glimpse of it in the mirror after a shower, the memory would flash back with perfect, horrifying clarity. The splintering sound of the wood, the searing pain, the way he stood over me and said, "Happy birthday." The scar was a part of my story, a story I had never told anyone. It was a constant, silent testament to the truth. And then, 3 months ago, the past refused to stay buried. An email arrived in my inbox. The sender was an anonymous, encrypted address. The subject line was a single, chilling question. Do you remember I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam? But something made me open it. The body of the email contained only one sentence. He's hurting someone else. Below the text was an attachment. My hand trembled as I clicked on it. It was a photograph, grainy and obviously taken in secret. It showed a young woman's arm, resting on the unfinished plywood of a construction site. Around her wrist was a dark, ugly bruise. The distinct, 5-fingered pattern a perfect match to the ghosts on my own skin. She looked young, maybe 19 or 20, in the background, out of focus. I could see Franklin's signature red work truck. My blood went cold. This wasn't a memory. This was happening now. He hadn't changed. He hadn't stopped. He had just found a new target. Someone else to silence. Someone else to blame. All the walls I had so carefully constructed over a decade crumbled in that single moment. The silence I had maintained, the distance I had created, it had not been a victory. It had been a retreat. And in my absence, he had been allowed to thrive, to continue his reign of terror unchecked. The file in my mind wasn't closed. It had just been waiting for new evidence. And this picture was it. It was proof. The years of silence were over. My silence. And his. Back in the suffocating humidity of the party, I met Franklin's smirk with a placid calm that I did not feel. His words, "Good to see you survived," echoed in my head, but they were drowned out by the memory of my mother's voice. You provoke him, and the sight of that ugly bruise on a stranger's wrist. He thought this was his stage, his audience, his victory lap. He had no idea he was just an actor. And I was the director. And I had already set the scene for his final performance. The first step in any operation is to assess the established channels. My first call, after staring at the photograph for what felt like a lifetime, was to the police department in my hometown. I went in person the next day, a folder in my hand containing a printed copy of the email and the image, my statement written out in clear, concise language. I sat across from a Sergeant Miller, a man with a tired face and a coffee-stained mustache, in a small, airless office that smelled of paperwork and indifference. He listened with a practiced patience, his eyes scanning my statement without really reading it. He looked at the photo, turning it over as if something might be written on the back. "An anonymous email," he said, his voice flat. "Sent from an encrypted address, ma'am. For all we know, this could be a prank, a doctored photo." "It's his work truck in the background," I insisted, my voice colder than I intended. "And that bruise, it's a pattern I recognize." He leaned back, the springs of his chair groaning in protest. "Franklin Doyle is a respected member of this community. He's on the town planning board. He donates to the Police Benevolent Fund every year. To launch an investigation based on a picture sent by a ghost, we need more than that. We need concrete evidence, a witness who's willing to come forward, a formal complaint." He looked at me, a flicker of something pity, or maybe just annoyance in his eyes. "Are you a disgruntled family member, Ms. Doyle? We get those sometimes." The dismissal was absolute. I was not a credible source. I was a potential problem. Franklin's carefully constructed public image was a shield no anonymous email could pierce. I was on my own. I thanked the sergeant for his time, walked out of the station into the bright, indifferent sunlight, and felt the last bit of faith I had in the system evaporate. The operation would proceed, but it would be my own, objective acquire incontrovertible proof. The next 2 months were a study in logistics and deception. My nights were spent in the blue glow of my laptop screen, a digital warrior preparing her arsenal. I researched surveillance technology with the intensity of a doctoral student, becoming an expert on things I never thought I'd need to know: megapixel resolution, infrared night vision capabilities, motion detection sensitivity, and data encryption protocols. I didn't want a simple security camera. I needed a silent, invisible witness. I settled on a set of 4 military-grade microcameras. They were wireless, weatherproof, had a 6-month battery life, and were disguised as ordinary objects: a screwhead, a landscape rock, a common electrical outlet cover. They recorded in 4K video and audio and streamed the encrypted feed directly to a secure cloud server I could access from anywhere. The price was steep, but justice, I was learning, was not cheap. The next phase was infiltration. I couldn't just show up and start planting cameras. I needed a legend, a believable cover story. I created the Oakwood Hills Community Safety Initiative. I spent a weekend designing a simple, professional-looking website with stock photos of smiling families and articles about deterring burglaries. I printed flyers on thick, glossy paper. My new persona was a concerned former resident, giving back to the community by offering free home security consultations. It was audacious. but the suburbs run on a currency of perceived safety and neighborly concern. I started at the far end of my mother's street, going door to door. I was polite, professional, and convincing. Most people declined, but a few, including the elderly couple 2 doors down from my mother, agreed enthusiastically. This was crucial. It made my presence in the neighborhood legitimate. When I finally knocked on my mother's door, my heart was a cold, steady drum against my ribs. She was shocked to see me, her hand flying to her mouth. I played my part, offering a hesitant smile and the flyer. I told her I was in town for this project, that I'd been thinking about her, about how exposed the back of her property was to the woods. I offered to install a few motion sensors and cameras, just for peace of mind. Franklin was there, of course. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He listened to my pitch, a sneer playing on his lips. When I was done, he laughed, a short, barking sound. "She's always dramatic," he said to my mother, as if I wasn't there, always making a big show out of nothing. But he didn't say no. In his world, I was a broken thing. My grand, dramatic gesture was, to him, just another pathetic cry for attention. He saw no threat. He saw a nuisance. He waved a dismissive hand and went back to his armchair. That was his mistake. He underestimated me. The installation took 2 days. Under the guise of checking sightlines and signal strength, I placed my witnesses with surgical precision. One camera, disguised as a bolt head, went into the fence post overlooking the entire backyard and deck. The second, the landscape rock, was nestled in the hydrangeas my mother loved, aimed directly at the back door. The third was inside the garage, the outlet cover, offering a view of his precious truck and the tools he was so proud of. The final one was the riskiest, the screwhead, placed in the trim of the hallway that led to the bedrooms. I felt a cold sweat on my neck as I drilled the pilot hole, Franklin's laughter from the living room echoing behind me. With the hardware in place, it was time for the final, most disgusting part of the plan, the charm offensive. I had to get inside. I called my mother a week later, my voice thick with practiced regret. I told her I was sorry for the years of silence, that I missed her, that I wanted to try and fix things. She cried. Of course, her relief was a palpable thing, a desperate, hungry need to believe her family could be whole again. She was my easiest mark, and the guilt of it was a bitter acid in my throat. I brought gifts, a pecan pie from a bakery she liked, expensive wine for Franklin. I sat in their living room, the one I had fled so many years ago, and I smiled. I asked about his business. I complimented my mother's garden. I played the part of the prodigal daughter, returned to the fold. Franklin watched me, his eyes like chips of flint. But my performance was flawless. My apology, my submission, my apparent defeat. It all fed his massive ego. A broken-down girl with a silly security project and a peace offering of pie was no threat. He agreed to the family barbecue for Aunt Rose's birthday. I was no longer a threat. I was a novelty. Harmless. He didn't know that every moment I was in that house. My phone was in my pocket, tethered to the Wi-Fi I had just reconnected to, testing the signal strength of my hidden network. He didn't know that my car, a nondescript sedan parked a block away, was my mobile command center. He didn't know that on the passenger seat sat a laptop, its screen alive with 4 silent, high-definition video feeds, watching his every move, the backyard, the garage, the hallway. The trap was set. The bait was me. I had created the perfect, sterile environment for a predator to reveal his nature. All the variables were controlled. The stage was lit. The witnesses were in place, their digital eyes unblinking. All I needed was the trigger. I just needed him to do what he always did. I just needed him to hit me. One more time. The air at the dinner table was a tight, invisible membrane, stretched to its breaking point. We were all playing our parts in a desperate pantomime of family. My cousins discussed property taxes. My uncle recounted a tedious story about his golf game, and my mother fluttered about, her anxiety manifesting as an obsessive need to keep everyone's wine glass full. Every word spoken was a careful step around the landmine of my presence. They spoke of everything except the last 2 years, of everything except why I was really here. I ate my potato salad in small, measured bites, a silent observer watching the performance. I could feel Franklin's eyes on me from the head of the table. He wasn't participating in the chatter. He was watching, waiting, nursing his beer like it was a weapon. The sun had dipped below the tree line, and the string lights now provided the primary illumination, casting long, dancing shadows across our faces. A lull fell over the table, one of those awkward silences where the only sound is the clinking of silverware. It was the opening Aunt Rose had been waiting for. She set her fork down, the tines clicking loudly against her plate. She had been refilling her Chardonnay with a liberal hand all evening, and her face was flushed with a mixture of alcohol and long-simmering resentment. "So, Clara," she began, her voice carrying across the table with manufactured sweetness. "Still no husband. 32 is getting up there, you know." The membrane tore. Every head at the table froze, eyes darting from her to me. This was the moment the charade ended and the real event began. My mother's face fell, a silent, "Please don't," forming on her lips. I could have ignored it. I could have offered a polite, deflective answer and allowed the fragile peace to be restored. But I wasn't here for peace. I was here for war. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. I carefully placed the glass back on the table, my movements deliberate. I looked directly at my aunt, whose smug smile was already anticipating her victory, and offered a small, serene smile of my own. "Still no soul." "Aunt Rose," I asked, my voice quiet, yet it seemed to cut through the humid evening air like a shard of ice. The effect was instantaneous. My uncle choked on a piece of steak. My cousin's wife gasped, her hand flying to her chest. A spoon clattered against a glass, a sharp, discordant chime in the sudden, dead quiet. No one spoke. No one breathed. They just stared, trapped between the two poles of a conflict they had spent years pretending didn't exist. Aunt Rose's face went from flushed pink to a blotchy, furious red. Franklin broke the spell. He pushed his chair back slightly, the sound of wood scraping on stone a deliberate, grating noise. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a cigarette and a lighter. The flick of the flint, the flare of the flame, the first, long drag. It was all a piece of theater, a display of unbothered control. He exhaled a plume of gray smoke that drifted across the table, momentarily obscuring his face. "You always had that mouth," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It was a statement of fact, a diagnosis of my lifelong disease of defiance. It was what he used to say right before his temper snapped, the verbal warning before the physical storm. The memory of it, the Pavlovian fear it was meant to trigger, rose up in me, but I beat it down. I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting on the table. The fast, frantic drumming of my own heart was the only thing that betrayed my calm exterior. "You always had that hand," I replied, my voice steady and clear. It was a direct hit, a line drawn. The subtext of 15 years of violence was now text, spoken aloud in front of the entire family. My mother shot to her feet, her chair nearly toppling over. Her face was a mask of sheer panic. "Enough, both of you," she started, her voice a frantic plea. But it was too late. He was already moving. He didn't stand up. He didn't need to. In one swift, brutal motion, he reached across the small space between us and grabbed the back of my chair, yanking it sideways with his full weight. The world tilted. I was thrown against the armrest. The air knocked from my lungs. My glass of red wine, full to the brim, thanks to my mother, tipped over, its contents splashing across the front of my white summer dress in a dark, arterial stain. The shock of the cold liquid was a jolt, but the violence of the action was a familiar, sickening lurch in my gut. Gasps rippled around the table. My mother cried out my name, but I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I gripped the arms of the chair to steady myself, the wood digging into my palms, slowly, deliberately. I righted myself. I didn't look at the stain. I didn't look at my mother or my horrified cousins. I lifted my head and looked directly into his eyes, and I did not look away. I held his furious, hateful gaze, my own expression unreadable, a silent challenge. Go on, finish it. And in that supercharged silent moment, a familiar click echoed from the corner of the yard. A clean white light flooded the patio, sharp and sudden, chasing away the soft, forgiving glow of the party lights. It bleached the color from every face, turning the scene into a stark, overexposed photograph. The motion sensor on the west fence post had activated. The backyard lights were on. The sound was almost imperceptible under the sudden wash of harsh, white light, but to me, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a tiny mechanical click. The motion sensor had done its job, and in response, the camera in the fence post had switched from low-power standby to its active recording protocol. Its internal buffer was now streaming a 4K, 30 frames per second video file, complete with high-fidelity audio, to the secure cloud server. The digital eye was open, and it was unblinking. The trap was sprung. Franklin was momentarily blinded by the floodlight, his face a mask of rage caught in a sudden spotlight. He didn't notice the click. He didn't see the tiny lens. His entire world had contracted to the space between us, to the challenge in my eyes, to the defiant set of my jaw. My spoken words, "You always had that hand," had bypassed his brain and gone straight to his muscles. It was an old, familiar circuit. Defiance met with force, question met with fist. His hand came up so fast the air seemed to split. It wasn't a push or a shove. It was a full-bodied, open-palmed strike, executed with the practiced efficiency of a man who knows how to use his weight. The sound of it, a sharp, wet crack, echoed across the suddenly silent yard. My head snapped to the side, my hair flying, the force of the blow radiating from my cheek down into my jaw and neck. For a split second, the world went white with a burst of static, and the taste of blood, coppery and sharp, filled my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. The collective gasp from the family was a physical thing, a sudden vacuum of air. My mother let out a high, keening shriek, a sound of pure, animal terror that she had suppressed for 15 years. I heard the scrape of chairs, the clatter of a fork, and then a loud crash as a plate, laden with half-eaten food, slid from the table and shattered on the stone patio. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Aunt Rose stumbling backward, her face a pale, slack-jawed mask of shock, the Chardonnay forgotten. The party was over. The ringing in my ears slowly subsided, replaced by the thumping of my own heart, a steady, powerful beat. The pain began to bloom on my face, a hot, throbbing fire. But beneath the pain, there was a layer of ice. I was not the 17-year-old girl anymore. I was a data analyst, and this was the primary data point I had come to collect. I methodically cataloged the event. Time of assault, 8:47 p.m. Assailant Franklin Doyle. Victim Clara Doyle. Witnesses. Approximately 20 family members. Physical evidence: visible contusion forming on left cheek, minor laceration inside mouth, and most importantly, digital evidence: one pristine, unassailable video file, currently being uploaded. Slowly, deliberately, I turned my head back to face him. I lifted my chin, letting the harsh security light illuminate the angry red mark that was already darkening on my skin. I met his wild, panting gaze. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He was expecting tears. He was expecting me to crumble, to run, to prove him right. I gave him none of it. I gave him my voice, low and steady, laced with a coldness that seemed to unnerve him more than any scream could have. "Keep going," I said, tasting the blood as I spoke. "You always finish what you start." It was a dare. It was pouring gasoline on a fire, and he was never one to back down from a dare. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and he took a step toward me, his body coiling like a predator about to spring. My mother screamed again. Franklin, no. But her voice was a gnat buzzing in a hurricane. His focus was entirely on me. He was going to wipe the calm, defiant look off my face. He was going to finish it. He lunged, but just as his hands came up, a new light joined the scene. It wasn't the steady white glare of the motion sensor. It was a strobing, rhythmic pulse of red and blue, painting the side of the house, the fence, and the terrified faces of my family in ghostly, flashing colors. It was followed by a second pulse and the faint, approaching wail of a siren, cutting through the night. Franklin froze mid-lunge, his head snapping toward the front of the house. Confusion, then dawning horror, washed over his face. The predator, so sure of his territory, had just heard the click of a much larger trap. Before I had even pulled into the neighborhood that evening, I had made a call. I had spoken to the 911 dispatcher, my voice calm and controlled. I had reported a non-emergency, a request for a wellness check. I said there was a family gathering that I was concerned might escalate. Given a history of volatility, I gave them the address and a time. I told them that if they didn't hear from me by 8:50 p.m., they should consider it an active domestic disturbance. It was 8:49. Two uniformed officers appeared at the gate to the backyard, their silhouettes stark against the flashing lights of their patrol cars. They were calm, professional, their eyes scanning the scene, taking in the shattered plate, my mother's terrified face, the dark red stain on my dress, the fresh, livid mark on my cheek, and Franklin, frozen in a posture of aggression. "What's going on here?" the first officer asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Franklin's composure snapped back into place with the force of a slammed door. His entire demeanor shifted from predator to victim. He straightened up, holding his hands out in a gesture of placation. His voice was a raw, pleading bellow of indignation. "Thank God you're here. Officers," he boomed, "she's out of control. She came here after 2 years, started insulting everyone, making a scene. She's unstable. She provoked me." It was his mantra, his shield. She provoked me. The words my mother had used, the words that had exonerated him in his own mind for 15 years. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face a mask of righteous anger. The rest of the family stood like statues, silent, terrified witnesses, their complicity hanging in the air. The officer looked from Franklin's furious face to my calm one. He looked at the bruise. His expression was neutral, betraying nothing. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I simply held the officer's gaze, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I lifted my hand and pointed, not at Franklin, not at my own face. I pointed past him, toward the dark wooden fence post standing sentinel in the corner of the yard. "The camera's right there," I said, my voice clear and even. It saw everything. A profound stillness fell over the backyard, broken only by the crackle of the police radio and the distant hum of the cicadas. Franklin's mouth, which had been open to continue his tirade, snapped shut, every head, including those of the 2 police officers, turned in unison, following the line of my outstretched finger. They all looked toward the fence post, their eyes searching in the glare of the security light, and in that moment, Franklin Doyle finally understood. He hadn't been cornered. He had been documented. The cameras, as they say, do not lie. The world seemed to hold its breath. My words, the cameras right there, hung in the air, severing the last thread of normalcy. The 2 officers, who had been assessing a chaotic family dispute, were now processing a new, critical piece of information. The senior officer, a man with graying temples and a calm, unreadable expression, shifted his gaze from the fence post back to Franklin. The shift was subtle, but absolute. The ambiguity of the situation had vanished. "Sir," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its questioning tone and gaining the hard edge of command, "turn around slowly. Place your hands behind your back." For a moment, Franklin didn't seem to comprehend. He stood, bathed in the alternating flashes of red and blue, his face a mask of disbelief. He, Franklin Doyle, was being spoken to like a common criminal, in his own backyard, in front of his family, he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious," he scoffed. "She's the one you should be arresting. She's trespassing. She's insane." The officer did not repeat his command. He simply took one step forward, and his partner mirrored the movement, flanking Franklin's other side. The officer's hand rested lightly on the grip of his holstered sidearm. It wasn't a threat, but a statement of intent. The time for discussion was over. The procedural machine had been activated, and it would now run its course. That simple, silent movement broke Franklin's defiance. He saw the cold, professional resolve in their eyes and realized his status, his reputation, meant nothing in this moment. He was no longer a community leader. He was a domestic assault suspect. His shoulders slumped, a visible deflation of his lifelong arrogance. He turned, his movements stiff and jerky, and placed his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic zip-click of the handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a closing door, of a final verdict, and with that sound, the dam of Franklin's rage burst. It was no longer the focused, intimidating anger he used as a tool of control. It was the wild, impotent fury of a cornered animal. "You bitch!" he roared, his head snapping around to glare at me, his face contorted and purple. "You did this. You planned this. You came into my house to destroy my life, to destroy this family." His words, raw and venomous, ripped through the stunned silence. Aunt Rose, who had been frozen in place, finally found her voice. It came out as a ragged, hysterical shriek. "He's right. She's tearing us apart. Get her out of here," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. But the most profound reaction was my mother's. She made no sound. As the second handcuff clicked shut, all the strength seemed to drain from her body at once. She crumpled into a nearby patio chair, not so much sitting as collapsing, her body folding in on itself. Her hands covered her face, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. She was a ruin, the collateral damage of a war she had refused to acknowledge for a decade and a half. The rest of the family remained a gallery of ghosts, their faces pale and horrified in the strobing police lights, trapped between the man they had enabled and the woman who had finally held him accountable. I watched it all unfold as if I were behind a thick pane of glass. I saw the scene. I heard the sounds. But the emotions couldn't reach me. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of victory. There was only a vast, quiet, hollow space opening up inside of me. For 15 years, my life had been defined by this conflict, first by surviving it, then by escaping it, and finally by planning my revenge against it. It had been a mountain that blocked my view of the future, and now, the mountain was being hauled away on the back of a truck, and the landscape beyond it was empty. The relief was real, a slow letting go of a breath I'd been holding since I was a teenager, but the emptiness was just as real. The fight was over, and I was alone on the battlefield. The younger of the two officers approached me, his movements careful, his expression softened with concern. He kept a respectful distance. He saw the bruise blooming on my cheek, the blood on my lip, the wine stain on my dress. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle. I looked at him, this stranger who had just become a pivotal character in my life story. I considered the question. Was I okay? No, yes, I didn't know, but I was free. I nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Finally," I said. The word was a quiet puff of air, but it felt like it carried the weight of my entire life. The senior officer was now reciting the Miranda rights to Franklin, his voice a calm, steady monotone that was a stark contrast to Franklin's continued, sputtering rage. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Each phrase was a nail in the coffin of the life Franklin had built. They began to lead him away, each officer holding one of his arms, guiding him through the gate and toward the waiting patrol car. He was still shouting, still trying to land one final blow, to reclaim some shred of control. You'll all see, she's a manipulative liar, she's poison. As they passed through the gate, just before he was out of my sight, Franklin twisted his body around, his eyes locking with mine one last time. The flashing lights illuminated the pure, undiluted hatred on his face. "You'll regret this, Clara," he spat, the words a final, desperate curse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The words weren't for him, or for the silent, broken family behind me. They were for me, a final closing entry in a logbook of pain. "I did," I said softly, almost a whisper to myself, "for 15 years. He was gone. They placed him in the back of the car, the door shutting with a solid, final thud. The sirens remained off, but the lights continued their silent, relentless rhythm. Red, blue, flashing across the manicured lawn, the expensive patio furniture, the cooling grill. They painted streaks of color across the pristine white siding of the house he had bought to own my mother, and they reflected, like captured, frantic stars, in the tears that now streamed from my mother's eyes, as she sat, broken, in the middle of the beautiful, perfect backyard he had built for her, in a small town. News doesn't travel, it ignites. The official report, buried in the police blotter of the weekly Oakwood Hills Chronicle, was a model of bureaucratic restraint. Franklin Doyle, 54, was arrested on Saturday evening following a domestic disturbance call. He has been charged with 1 count of misdemeanor assault, but the official report is never the real story. The real story travels through fiber optic cables and hushed phone calls, over coffee at the diner and whispers in the checkout line at the grocery store. By Monday morning, the Oakwood Hills Community Forum on Facebook was a raging tire fire of speculation and judgment. The post, started by a neighbor who had seen the flashing lights, had hundreds of comments. The digital town square had convened, and I was on trial as much as Franklin was. The lines were drawn quickly and predictably. There was the Franklin Doyle fan club, a vocal majority. These were the people who knew the man who sponsored the Little League team, the man who served on the town planning board, the man whose company had put a new roof on the library at a discount. "Frank is a pillar of this community," wrote one woman. "There are 2 sides to every story, and I know for a fact that his stepdaughter was always a troubled kid. She ran away. You know," another chimed in. "This sounds like a cash grab. She shows up after years of silence right when his business is doing better than ever." Suspicious. They painted a picture of me as a vindictive, unstable interloper, a serpent in their suburban Eden. They defended him with a ferocity that was less about Franklin himself and more about defending their own judgment, their own carefully constructed sense of a safe and orderly world where good men don't do bad things. Then there was the other side. They were quieter, their comments more cautious, but they were there. I worked for him for a few months back in '08. The man has a temper like a live wire. This doesn't surprise me at all. Or, from an anonymous profile, ask anyone who's had to deal with him on a contract dispute. He's a bully. These were the dissenting whispers, the ones who had seen the cracks in his public facade all along. I read it all from the sterile quiet of a cheap motel room on the edge of town, a digital ghost watching my own life being debated by strangers. I didn't comment. I didn't engage. It felt like watching a weather report about a hurricane that had already passed over you. The damage was done. The rest was just noise. My phone, however, was a different story. It was a constant barrage of notifications from a life I thought I'd left behind. Old high school acquaintances, distant cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Most of the messages were a variation on the same theme, a tentative digital hand on the shoulder. "Hey, Clara, heard what happened. Just wanted to say I'm thinking of you. I'm so sorry you went through that. I never liked him." And then, the one that mattered. "You did the right thing." That message, or ones very much like it, came from a surprising number of people. It came from women who had known my mother their whole lives, from men who had played poker with my father. They were short, direct messages, devoid of gossip or questions. They were acknowledgments. They had seen, they had known, on some level, and my actions had given them permission to finally admit it. My mother, however, was a black hole of silence. I had tried calling her the day after the arrest, but it went straight to voicemail. A text message I sent remained unread. When I searched for her on social media, her profile was gone, deactivated. She had unplugged herself from the world, unable to face the public wreckage of the life she had so desperately tried to pretend was perfect. Her silence was the loudest condemnation of all. It was the sound of her shame, her complicity, her complete and utter devastation. I realized then, sitting in the blue glow of my phone screen, that the truth doesn't necessarily make anyone happy. It doesn't heal old wounds or magically mend broken relationships. What it does is far more brutal and far more necessary. It makes them silent. It takes away the lie. You can no longer pretend. My mother could no longer pretend she had a good, strict husband. The town could no longer pretend he was a simple pillar of the community. The truth had arrived, and it had demanded silence. A week passed in a blur of legalities. I gave my official statement to the police, handed over the password to the cloud server where the video was stored, and met with a prosecutor from the district attorney's office. She was a young, sharp woman who watched the video with a grim, tight-lipped expression. "This is an airtight case, Ms. Doyle," she'd said. "Thank you for your courage." I didn't feel courageous. I felt like a demolitions expert who had just successfully brought down a condemned building. It was a technical success, but I was still standing in a pile of rubble. On the 8th day, an envelope was slid under my motel room door. It had no stamp and no return address. My name was written on the front in a neat, youthful script. Inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper, folded in half. The message was short. "I don't know if you'll get this. My mom found out what motel you were in. I heard what happened to Mr. Doyle. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for making him stop." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. It was from the young woman in the photograph, the anonymous emailer, the reason I had come back. I read the note 3 times, my fingers tracing the letters. This small piece of paper was the one thing that cut through the noise, the legal jargon, the emptiness. It was the proof of purpose. My pain had been a solitary confinement. Her note was the key turning in the lock, letting me know I wasn't alone in that prison. I carefully folded the letter and tucked it deep inside my wallet, a secret testament against the emptiness. The local news eventually ran a follow-up piece, quoting unnamed sources and hinting at a history of conflict. In the comments section of the newspaper's website, someone had written, "This isn't justice. This is just a cold, calculated revenge plot by a bitter stepdaughter." I read the word revenge. People would call it that. It was a simple, dramatic word for a complex and ugly thing. But they were wrong. Revenge is a hot, passionate act. What I had done was cold. It was methodical. It was the long-delayed application of a consequence. It was the act of holding up a mirror and forcing a monster to see his own reflection. It wasn't revenge. It was self-defense 15 years late. She found me 2 weeks later. The trial date had been set. The lawyers were circling, and the initial shockwave in the town had subsided into a low, persistent rumble of gossip. I was still in the motel, living a strange, suspended life out of a single suitcase. There was a soft, hesitant knock on the door one afternoon. It wasn't the brisk rap of housekeeping. It was a knock I hadn't heard in 14 years, but recognized instantly. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered, not just physically, but as if her entire presence in the world had shrunk. Her face was pale and puffy, etched with new lines of grief and exhaustion. She wore a simple dress that hung on her frame, and her eyes, the same blue as mine, were red-rimmed and hollow. She didn't look like a wife whose husband was in jail. She looked like a widow. She clutched her purse to her stomach like a shield. We stood there for a long moment in the doorway, the silence thick with everything we had never said. The stale, air-conditioned air of my room mingled with the humid afternoon outside. Finally, I stepped back, a silent invitation. and she walked in, her movements uncertain, as if she were entering a stranger's home, which, I supposed, she was. She didn't sit. She drifted to the window and looked out at the parking lot, at the endless river of cars on the highway beyond. I remained by the door, closing it softly. The room was small and impersonal, with its cheap art bolted to the wall and its faded floral bedspread. It was a place for transients, for people between lives. It was the perfect setting for this conversation. "I went to see him," she said, her voice a dry whisper, still facing the window. "Yesterday, at the county jail, through a piece of glass." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that. She finally turned to face me, and her eyes were swimming with a desperate, pleading sorrow. "He blames you for everything." "I know," I said. My voice was flat, an echo in the quiet room. And then came the words I knew she had to say. The words she had probably practiced 1,000 times in the dark, the cornerstone of her entire defense, not for him, but for herself. "I didn't know, Clara," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know it was that bad." The lie was so old, so worn out from use, that it was almost transparent. It hung in the air between us, flimsy and pathetic. I looked at this woman, my mother, and the anger I expected to feel wasn't there. It had been burned out of me long ago, leaving only a cold, hard ash of certainty. I saw her not as a monster, but as something far more tragic, a coward. "You didn't want to," I replied. My words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, a correction to the historical record, and they shattered her. A ragged sob tore from her throat, and the dam of her denial finally broke. The tears she had been holding back for years streamed down her face, unchecked. I thought if I kept quiet, he'd stop. She choked out between gasps, her whole body shaking. I thought if I just made everything nice, if I didn't argue, if I didn't provoke him, that he would calm down, that it would pass. I thought I was protecting you by keeping the peace. She sank onto the edge of the stiff, uncomfortable chair by the window, her purse falling to the floor. She buried her face in her hands, and the sound of her weeping filled the small room. It was the sound of a lifetime of self-deception collapsing in on itself. She had traded my safety for a fragile, illusory peace, and now she had lost both. I watched her cry, and I felt nothing but a profound, weary distance. Her pain was real, I knew, but it was a continent away from my own. I could see her suffering, but I could no longer feel it as part of me. The daughter who would have run to comfort her had died in a hallway. 15 years ago, I was the ghost that daughter had left behind. I walked over to the small kitchenette, filled a cheap plastic cup with water from the tap, and set it on the table beside her. She didn't acknowledge it. I went and sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under my weight, and I waited. I let her cry it all out, the grief and the guilt and the shame. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she reached for the cup of water, her hand trembling. She took a small sip. She wouldn't look at me. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, staring into the cup. "I've put the house on the market. His lawyer says he'll have to sell it anyway, for the legal fees. I'm going to go stay with my sister in Oregon for a while, figure things out." The house, my childhood home, the place he had bought to own her, it was being sold, another ghost being exorcised. I pictured it empty, the rooms scrubbed clean of their history, waiting for a new family to fill them with new joys and new sorrows. I just nodded. The news didn't bring me satisfaction, only a sense of finality. A chapter was closing. She finally lifted her head and looked at me, her eyes raw and swollen. "I'm so sorry, Clara." I met her gaze. I could see the desperate hope in her eyes, the plea for a word, a gesture, any small sign of absolution, but I had nothing left to give her. Forgiveness was a currency I had spent all on myself, just to survive. "Just don't invite him back this time," I said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of a closing tomb. Her face crumpled, but she nodded, accepting the sentence. She knew it was the only thing left, a boundary, a future she could not cross. She stood, picked up her purse, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob, her back to me. "I do love you," she whispered, and then she was gone. The door clicked shut, and I was alone again in the silence. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it had to be. "Clara, this is Rose. I just want to say how terribly sorry I am. I had no idea. If I had known what he was like, I never would have. I hope you can forgive me." I stared at the message, at the neat, complete sentences. I had no idea. The same lie my mother had tried to sell. The convenient blindness of the willfully ignorant. Her apology wasn't for her years of quiet complicity, for the sneers and the judgments. It was for the inconvenience of having been made a witness. It was a plea to wipe her own conscience clean. I held my thumb over the screen, tempted to type back, to unleash a torrent of rage. But I didn't. I just turned the screen off and set the phone down. Deleting the message felt more final, more dismissive, than any angry reply could have been. Some apologies, I realized, only arrive after the backyard lights have come on. They are born not of empathy, but of exposure. They are the panicked confessions of people caught in the sudden, unforgiving glare of the truth, desperate to distance themselves from the darkness they had been comfortable living in. But I would always remember, it wasn't the darkness that was the problem. The darkness had always been there, festering under the string lights and the polite dinner conversation. The problem was that no one had been willing to flip the switch. That harsh, artificial light from the motion sensor hadn't created the ugliness. It had only revealed what was already there, in the shadows, all along. The courtroom was a theater of manufactured solemnity. Everything was polished wood and muted colors, designed to project an aura of unassailable gravity. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of old paper and floor wax. It was packed. The public gallery was a sea of familiar faces from town, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim fascination. They were here for the final act of the drama that had consumed local gossip for months. I saw some of the neighbors, the couple who had let me install my test cameras on their property, a few people from my high school class. Aunt Rose was there, squeezed into the back row, looking pale and diminished, and in the front row, directly behind the prosecution's table, sat my mother, a solitary, black-clad figure staring at her own hands, which were clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. Then there was Franklin. He sat at the defense table, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his hair neatly combed. He looked like a man about to attend a board meeting, not a man facing a felony assault charge. He was performing respectability with every fiber of his being. He conferred in low tones with his lawyer, a slick, expensive-looking man named Peterson, occasionally shaking his head with an expression of weary disbelief. He was playing the part of the wronged man, the victim of a malicious plot, and from the whispers I could hear behind me, some in the audience were buying it. When it was my turn to take the stand, a hush fell over the room. My footsteps echoed as I walked to the witness box. I swore the oath, my voice clear and steady in the quiet. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked out. I didn't look at Franklin. I didn't look at my mother. I looked at the jury. 12 ordinary citizens tasked with excavating the truth from a mountain of lies. The prosecutor, Ms. Davies, took me through the events of that night with a calm, methodical precision. Her questions were simple and direct, designed to build a foundation of fact. My answers were the same, short, factual, devoid of emotion. I was a narrator recounting a story that had happened to someone else. Then it was Peterson's turn. He approached the witness stand with a practiced, confident stride. He gave the jury a brief, sympathetic smile before turning to me. His strategy was clear from his first question to discredit the witness by assassinating her character. "Ms. Doyle," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "You were estranged from your family for over a decade. Is that correct?" I had not been in contact with my mother or stepfather for 2 years. I corrected, I left their home 14 years ago. 14 years, he repeated, letting the number hang in the air. And then, after all that time, you suddenly decide to return. You concoct an elaborate story about a community safety initiative to gain access to the property. You install a sophisticated, hidden surveillance system, and then you attend a family party. It all seems very premeditated, very calculated. It was, I said simply. A murmur went through the courtroom. Peterson raised an eyebrow, surprised by my directness. It was, he pressed. So you admit this was a pre-planned operation? I admit I took measures to ensure my safety and to document what I believed was likely to happen. I said. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. He thought he had me. He began to pace slowly in front of the jury box, his voice dripping with insinuation. So you went to your mother's home, a family party, expecting a confrontation. It sounds less like you were ensuring your safety, and more like you were seeking a specific outcome. Tell me, Ms. Doyle, why did you really come back that night? He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine, posing the question he believed would be my undoing. He expected me to talk about reconciliation, about family, an answer he could then tear apart as a lie. He expected me to become emotional, defensive. I paused, letting the silence in the courtroom draw tight. I met his gaze without flinching. Because I knew he'd hit me again, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure in the room. Peterson's smug expression faltered. The jury's eyes were fixed on me. I heard a strangled gasp from the front row where my mother sat. My answer hadn't been an excuse. It had been an indictment. It reframed the entire narrative not as a plot I had authored, but as a predictable, inevitable conclusion to a story he had been writing for years. Peterson stammered for a moment, thrown completely off his script. He tried to recover, to paint my certainty as arrogance, as proof of my manipulative nature, but the damage was done. My testimony was the truth, and it had the unassailable weight of a physical law, like gravity. When he was done, Ms. Davies stood. The prosecution would now like to present Exhibit A, she announced, the video recording from the evening in question. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. For a moment, it was blank, and then it flickered to life. The image was perfectly clear, the audio pristine. There we were, the whole family, sitting around the patio table under the warm glow of the string lights. The camera's wide-angle lens captured the entire scene. The audience in the courtroom watched my audience in the video. They heard Aunt Rose's snide question. They heard my sharp reply. They saw Franklin light his cigarette. They heard him say, "You always had that mouth." And they heard me reply, "You always had that hand." A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. They watched my mother stand. Her face panicked. They saw, in brutal high definition, Franklin's arm shoot out, the violent yank of the chair, the red wine splashing across my dress, and then the click and the sudden, harsh flood of the security light. And then they saw the slap. The video captured it perfectly, the speed of his hand, the sharp, ugly crack of the impact, the way my head snapped back. My mother's scream, raw and piercing, filled the courtroom. On the screen, the family scattered like startled birds, and then my recorded voice, quiet but clear, spoke the words, "Keep going. You always finish what you start." Ms. Davies paused the video there. The image of Franklin's enraged face, lunging toward me, was frozen on the screen, a monstrous portrait of unchecked fury. The silence in the room was now heavy, suffocating. I glanced at the defense table. Franklin was no longer looking up. He was staring down at the polished wood, his head bowed, the respectable suit now looking like a cheap costume. From the front row, the sound of my mother's weeping was the only noise. The jury avoided looking at Franklin. They looked at the screen, at me, their faces grim and set. The video had not just shown them an act of violence. It had shown them the truth of a dynamic, the casual terror of a bully who had never been challenged, The cameras didn't lie. The rest was a formality. The closing arguments felt like an epilogue. When the jury filed out, no one spoke. They were back in less than an hour. We all stood as they entered. I watched the foreman's face. He would not meet Franklin's eyes. He looked at the judge. On the charge of assault in the second degree, how do you find, the clerk asked. Guilty, the foreman said. My mother's sob was a gut-wrenching sound in the quiet room. Franklin did not move. The judge thanked the jury and then addressed him. He spoke of the abuse of trust, of the evidence presented, of the need for accountability. And then he brought the gavel down. The sound was like a door slamming shut on my past. 5 years. State penitentiary. 2 bailiffs moved to Franklin's side. I watched, a detached observer, as they instructed him to stand and place his hands behind his back. I watched the handcuffs go on for the second and final time. His expensive lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he shook it off. As the bailiffs began to lead him out of the courtroom through a side door, he had to pass by the prosecution's table. He stopped, just for a second, and turned his head. His eyes, burning with a cold, dead hatred, found mine. The bailiffs tugged at his arm, but he held his ground for one last moment. He leaned in just enough, his voice a low, venomous whisper that only I could hear. You set me up. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I held his gaze, and I gave him the truth, the final, simple equation of his downfall. No, I said, my voice just as quiet. You replayed yourself. The bailiffs pulled him away then, and he was gone. The house was a hollow shell. A for sale sign was hammered into the front lawn, its bold red letters a stark announcement of the end of an era. The real estate agent had given me the key that morning, a small, cold piece of metal that felt impossibly heavy in my hand. My mother was already in Oregon, and the house had been emptied of everything that had made it a home. All that was left were the ghosts and the fixtures. I had come back for the fixtures. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the bare hardwood floors. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light pouring through the grimy windows. The walls were scarred with the faint outlines of picture frames, pale rectangles where family portraits and cheap art had once hung. I could almost smell the phantom scents of my mother's pot roast and Franklin's cigars, but it was just a trick of memory. The only real smell was of dust and stale, trapped air. The house was no longer a place of pain or fear. It was just a building, a collection of wood and nails and drywall, waiting to be filled with someone else's life. It had no power over me anymore. I went out the back door, the hinges groaning in protest. The backyard was a mess. The grass was overgrown, dotted with weeds. The hydrangeas my mother had so carefully tended were wilting, their heavy heads drooping toward the ground. The expensive patio furniture was gone, leaving only clean squares on the weathered stone where the table legs had been. The space felt larger, emptier, without the pretense of happy family gatherings to fill it. It was just a patch of earth, reclaiming itself. I stepped off the patio and onto the grass, and just like that, there was a click, and the world was flooded with clean, white light. The motion sensor on the western fence post, my silent, loyal soldier, was still on duty. It bathed the neglected yard in a harsh, clinical glare, turning the overgrown weeds into sharp, intricate shadows. The suddenness of it didn't make me flinch. It felt familiar, right. I stood there for a long time, in the center of the lawn, letting the light wash over me. The low, buzzing thrum of 1,000 cicadas vibrated in the humid air, the eternal soundtrack of suburban summer nights. The light was warm on my skin. It wasn't the menacing spotlight of that night. It was just light, a tool, doing the job it was designed to do. It detected motion, and it turned on. Simple, unemotional, incontrovertible. My gaze drifted up, finding the small, dark circle of the camera lens nestled beside the light. My star witness, the unblinking eye that had seen the truth in a way no human witness ever could. It had not judged. It had not flinched. It had not looked away. It had simply recorded. I thought about the jury's faces as they watched the video, the dawning comprehension, the quiet, grim certainty. The camera had given them my eyes, my memory, without the filter of trauma or the accusation of bias. I raised my head, looking directly at the lens. The light was bright in my eyes, but I didn't squint. "You saw everything," I whispered, the words swallowed by the vastness of the yard and the drone of the insects. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was a benediction, an acknowledgement, a final closing of the file. "Thank you for your service." A warm breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree at the edge of the property. It drifted toward the house and slipped through a half-open window in what used to be the dining room, stirring the thin, dusty curtains my mother had forgotten to take down. I watched them dance for a moment, pale ghosts in the empty house. It was time. I went into the garage and found the breaker box. With a firm, satisfying thud, I flipped the switch that controlled the outdoor electricity. The light in the backyard died, plunging the world back into the soft, forgiving twilight. My operation was officially decommissioned. Retrieving the equipment was a quiet, methodical ritual. I used a stepladder to reach the fence post, my screwdriver making small, precise sounds in the quiet as I removed the camera disguised as a bolt head. It was cool to the touch. I took down the motion sensor. I plucked the landscape rock from the dying hydrangeas and unscrewed the outlet cover from the garage wall. I even retrieved the tiny screw head from the hallway trim, spackling over the small hole with a tube I'd brought with me, erasing the evidence of my own intrusion. I placed each component carefully into a padded canvas bag. They were no longer instruments of war. They were just electronics. With the bag slung over my shoulder, I walked through the empty house one last time. I locked the back door. I walked to the front, stepped outside, and locked the front door behind me. I dropped the key through the mail slot, the clatter of it hitting the floor inside a final, lonely echo. I walked down the driveway, my heels clicking on the asphalt. I didn't look back. There was no reason to. The past was a locked house. My car was parked down the street, a small, dark shape, waiting to take me toward an unknown future. As I reached the end of the driveway, the edge of the property line, some instinct made me pause. I turned my head for one last look. And as I did, the backyard light clicked on. It must have been a trick of the angle, the sensor just catching the edge of my movement as I turned. A final, unintentional farewell. It bathed the empty yard in its stark, honest light one more time. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of triumph or of happiness. It was a smile of peace, of release. The light was no longer a spotlight exposing a crime. It wasn't a beacon of vengeance. It was just a light in a backyard, chasing away the shadows. It was illuminating the path for me to walk away. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me to be able to share it. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from today. I love seeing how far these stories can travel. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support the channel and help this story be heard by more people, hit that hype button. It helps more than you know.